Okay, James is giving the thumbs up. You're there. Welcome back again. I think your parents say hi. We hope and pray you get well soon. Yes, you're coughing. I can. You'll be over it soon and be healed. Hallelujah. Right, and our last slice then, I think, for this weekend, I suppose, until we see each other again. I want to dip into Ephesians to again illustrate how this model works that Shaul is busy unpacking all the way through here. And I think if we think of what his comment there is, if you are in Messiah, then you are Abraham's seed, then you literally become part of Israel in a real way, a supernatural way that only God can do, by giving us his righteousness, bringing us into the family in that way. You are no longer a Gentile, you now become part of Israel, Jewish people. And the question then becomes, well, how close does that go? How deep does that conversion go in Messianic sense? Again, just don't forget the global context here. When people were being born again in the first century, they didn't just go to the Baptist church on the corner of the road in Jerusalem. There was no Baptist church in Jerusalem, or anywhere else in Israel for that matter. And there wouldn't be for thousands of years. What we understand and see clearly here is that Messianic Jews and Gentiles who were being grafted in as well came in and joined him by faith in the living God of Israel, were joining synagogues. Later on, those synagogues became more and more Messianic synagogues as we go into the 2nd century, as often the now proto-rabbinic synagogues were pushing out the Messianic Jews from the synagogues. In fact, there's one of the blessings in the Adat, the standing prayer that we do every day. There's a curse upon heretics. And this one, the Benyamin, was added by Yavne, the group of rabbis who were studying and creating rabbinic Judaism. They added this curse into the Amidah because they knew that Messianic Jews could never pray it, because they knew it was aimed at them. All these are some theories. And therefore, when they stopped praying the Amidah at that point, everyone would go, you're one of them. They knew. And so they were able to kick them out of the synagogue. And at that point, really Messianic Jews needed to start building their own communities, and so this began to happen as you then go through the 2nd century. But up to that point, the movement had been very much into Israel and joining the Jewish community, and that really continued for 400 years. The reason why Chrysostom attacked Gentiles from keeping what he saw as the Judaic customs, and he virulently attacked this as an anti-Semite, was precisely because that's what people were doing. You don't attack something that doesn't exist. Right? The equivalent to that would be if I wrote to the Maltese government ranting about these ridiculous igloos being built on the beach in the north of Malta. And if I wrote to the government about that, they're going to go, what are you even on about? There are no igloos on the beach. We haven't even got any ice. It's 40 degrees outside, don't you know? Right? You don't fight against something that isn't there. You fight against something that is there. And this is how historians are now increasingly understanding these letters of the church fathers and realizing they're in an absolute battle to try and kill Messianic Judaism and build a Gentile church. They're in a battle to do this, but that shows us that right up through those early 400 years, Messianic Judaism is still alive. It's thriving. And in fact, you've still got Gentiles going along and joining this and saying, we need to keep Passover. Why? Well, our Messiah died at Passover. That's why we've got to keep it. That's what it is. So you go on. In fact, the connections then become really, really deep. So just how far does it go? Here we are, Ephesians 2. There's some fantastic passages here. This is 11 to 13, and 19 and 3-6. So I'm just going to dip in, but the whole section of it really is worth examining in detail for a midweek study or something. It's a fantastic section. He says, right, therefore remember that you, once Gentiles in the flesh. Who is Shaul talking to in this letter at this point? He's not talking to his Jewish brothers and sisters. He's talking to former Gentiles. Notice that, who you once Gentiles in the flesh, i.e., you are no longer Gentiles. Ouch. There it is, black on white. We knew it all the time and we never even saw it. Not even hiding, it's hiding in plain sight in your eyes. So he's talking to these people, so you who formerly were Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision, by what is called the circumcision made in the flesh by hands, in other words, by Jewish people, right? Back to what we said yesterday, there's only two groups of people on the earth. There's Jews, and then there's Gentiles. That's it. There's no other groups. He says, at that time, right, when you were still a Gentile, this is what you were, in verse 12. You were without Messiah. Tick. You were a Gentile. Gentiles don't have Messiah. Of course you were. You were without Messiah. You were an alien from the commonwealth of Israel. Tick. You were. You were a Gentile. You weren't part of Israel. You weren't a Jew. Right? So you were an alien to the commonwealth of Israel. You were a stranger from the covenants of promise. Tick. You were a Gentile. These covenants have got nothing to do with you. Abraham, Moshe, right? They're not yours, they're ours, they're Israel's. You know, there's only one covenant made with Gentiles, mentioned in the Torah. What's that one? The Noahide covenant. I will not bring the flood on the world again. Look at the rainbow, that's the only one. All the other covenants you've got here, God is making with Israel. These are ours. Ours for a purpose, because you've got a job to do to show this world the living God exists. But notice also, covenants has a plural, an S. Such an important S. Such an important plural. It's not just the covenant of promise, covenants of promise. All of the Jewish covenants. Right? He says, they weren't yours, you were a Gentile. You had nothing to do with this, they were ours. Next thing he says that you were as a Gentile, you had no hope no hope and without God in the world. Tick, what you were a Gentile. You had no hope. What was your hope? That tomorrow it might not rain. You know, that was it. You were without God in the world. Yes, the definition of being a Gentile is someone who does not know God. That's what a Gentile is. If you know God, you're a Jew, because that's what Jews are. Jewish people are those who know God, because he called us as a nation, as a people. So it's an interesting list that shown here defines for us what a Gentile is. And he says, but now, in Messiah Yeshua, you who were once afar off, the Gentiles, because right, they're out there, they're not right up close to God in the temple in the land, which is close to God. You who were once afar off, the Goyim, have been made near and brought near by the blood of Yeshua. Now, again, you can read this and you can just think, okay, we've just been brought near to God, and I know how Christians interpret this verse. Read the books on Jewish conversion, and this is exactly the terminology you will read in those books. It is a bringing near to Israel those who were afar off. And in fact, the rabbis always say to Gentiles who convert to Judaism that you are highly praised in heaven because you have the longer journey to walk. We were born Jews. We've had the Torah from that high. You never did. And yet still you've come in. And so actually the prevailing attitude in Judaism, despite a few bad eggs, is essentially that proselytes and converts in Judaism are highly valued and praised. Why? Because they never knew about God and they had a long, long walk. Way longer than anyone who was born Jewish has in all this. But now you have been brought near by the blood of Mashiach. So that means, now in Messiah, you're no longer a Gentile, you've been brought near. So we can now flip his list on its head, logically. So let's go back to verse 12. Now you would say, at this time you are with Messiah. Yeah, amen. You've received Messiah, you're born again. You are now not an alien from the commonwealth of Israel. Ooh, really? Really? You are now part of the commonwealth of Israel. Now again, I know the church comes along and says, yeah, that's right, spiritual Israel, that's us, the church. The new Israel. The old Israel of the flesh, God has finished with that, that's done. The new Israel. That isn't what this is not replacement theology we're reading here. Not at all. Shall we say that now you were that, but now God has brought you into the commonwealth of Israel? When he talks about Israel, he's not spiritualizing it, he's talking about Israel, Jewish people. That's the pattern that you see all the way through. Okay, so now you're in the commonwealth of Israel. You are no longer a stranger from the covenants of promise. If the covenants of promise are now yours because of your born-again experience and being brought into Israel, then those covenants, which, by the way, we remember were given to Israel, they are now yours. It's amazing. That means the Abrahamic covenant is now yours. It means the Mosaic covenant is now yours. The renewed covenant is now yours. They're operative in your life because you have crossed over just as Abraham did the Ephraim and come in and join. Now, he says, in Messiah, you do have hope in the world and you are with God in the world. Now, you can't rip this verse apart and just cherry pick the bits you like. Let me read this in a Christian way. They would say something like this: but now you are with Messiah and you have hope and you are with God in this world. You could hear that from any pulpit in any church. But that isn't what it says, is it? There's bits about Israel in the middle of it you cannot ignore. It's there. And if the other bits are true, and they are, then these other bits about being in Israel are true too. Sort of incredibly close contact that now of this ex-Gentile that you've got. So close, as we said yesterday in Romans 11 about being grafted into the tree. People standing afar and looking back and looking at the tree, they're not going to know who was the real branch and who was the grafted in. All they're looking at is a tree that is blossoming and blooming and bringing forth good fruit because of what's been going on with the engrafting. That's what will be seen. And it's exactly the same here. So the people looking in, they will not even be able to tell the difference. No, you won't. You come to Adat Yeshua Synagogue in Norwich, I challenge you as you walk through the door, start making a note of who you think was born Jewish and those who think were not. You won't get very far because we're one family. You won't see the distinction. And yet, if you ask people to say, yeah, I've got, we've come, I think I did, just as a quick head count, I don't really like doing it and keeping on top of it, but I think the last time when someone actually asked us specifically about this, I think it came out something around about a quarter of the people, or a third of the people in AY have got Jewish background or Jewish parentage, so DNA line, which actually for a Messianic synagogue is quite high. Most have much lower than that around the world, so 30% maybe is quite a high number. And the rest are converts. Who've come in from the church, or they've come in as just Gentiles off the street and got saved and have joined us. And it's wonderful when that happens because they don't come in with any Christian baggage. They come in and get saved and discipled in the faith right from the get-go as a Jewish person who's come in and joined the community. And you don't have these battles about theology that you all go through trying to detox to try and understand all of this. You don't have that situation. Okay, so now you have been brought near by the blood of Messiah. Really, really near. And then we go on to verse 19. Now therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. Hallelujah. Now again, you can't be more clear than that, can you really, in many ways. You are no longer a stranger to all us. You're not a foreigner to Israel. You're one of us now. In fact, not just one of us, you are a fellow citizen. Actually, in modern terms, maybe we should go to the Israeli government and quote this verse and say, can I have a passport, please? Exactly. Because it does mean this. It really does mean exactly this. You now are a fellow citizen, the saints and members of the household of God. The household of God is Israel. It's the Jewish people. That's what it is, clearly. And it says, now that you are a member of the saints are the Kedoshim. The Kedoshim in Hebrew are Israelites, Jewish people, the holy ones of God, the sanctified ones, the saints. It's not a Catholic thing at all, because that's probably what it rings a bell for you. This is not about that, St. Barnabas or whatever, it's not St. Martin, it's not about that. You are part of the Kedoshim of Adonai, which means you're part of Israel. It's abundantly clear when you look at it from here. Now, let's go back for a second because it gets a little bit more interesting at this point as well. It says here, you were an alien from the Commonwealth of Israel. Now, my Bible translates it as Commonwealth of Israel. Not sure what yours is, what Stern translates it. The historic English translation is the Commonwealth of Israel. If you know anything about English history, the Commonwealth means a lot. Right? But the English idea of a Commonwealth is separate nations kind of being affiliated with. That is not what this is talking about. We know this is true because bizarrely the same Greek word is behind the word Commonwealth in verse 12 as citizenship in verse 19. So why did the translators choose to translate it differently? Because they were scared and rigid that people would understand that you're actually a part of Israel. And so they muddy the waters by saying it's the Commonwealth. It isn't the Commonwealth. You could effectively translate that and say you were an alien from the citizenship of Israel. That's how you could legitimately translate that word into English. But Commonwealth really makes this vague kind of, the Caribbean ex-slaves through an English mind. And that's so wrong. It's so wrong. That is clearly not what it is talking about here. It says, now you are a fellow citizen with the Kedoshim, the holy ones, and members of the household of God. There's one of the things I'm talking about in my book, which will be out hopefully next year. One of the aspects of conversion in the first century was something called a socialization program. There were essentially 4 steps you had to do to convert, become a proselyte to Judaism in the first century. The 4 in themselves are not adequate because it doesn't talk about faith, but they were in operation certainly for Shaul and during his time. And one of those 4 is a socialization program or a re-socialization program. And what that basically means is that you are taken out of the social context in which you lived as a Gentile and you're re-socialized into Israel, the Jewish community. There's a transition that happens as part of your conversion. And I find it really interesting that actually Ephesians 2 really talks about this re-socialization. You were this, you were that, but now you're this and now you're that. There's a movement that's gone on here where you're now embedded into Israel and you're now part of us. It's one of the reasons why our Gateway program takes about 18 months to 2 years to do, because it takes time to work through all these issues, to kind of re-embed yourself into a different social environment. Okay, the next one, 3, I'm just going to jump in here, 3 and verse 6. It says here that the Gentiles, the Goyim, should be fellow heirs of the same body, partakers of his promise in Messiah through the gospel. Now, there's one little peculiarity on this verse which needs to be highlighted as well, which is how Shaul uses the word Gentile. He doesn't always consistently use it in the same way. It's rather like when we're talking about circumcision. There are times when he's talking about circumcision and he means circumcision. And there's other times when he's using the word circumcision to mean salvation. But you've got to know the context in which he's using these words to get the meaning out. And this is another classic example here. It's not that the Gentiles should be fellow heirs. He's saying here effectively that God has opened the door for the Gentiles to come in and become fellow heirs. That's what he's saying. Because you can't have a Gentile as a Gentile come and join the holy people. It's very interesting when it says, back in Solomon's time, this temple, this house, shall be a house of prayer for whom? All the nations to come in. But here's the nut, right? And of course Yeshua criticizes the priesthood in the first century precisely because they are not allowing those of the nations to come in. And he quotes that verse because actually he says, look, your job, you had one job to show the nations that the God of Israel lives and to draw in the converts and proselytes to Judaism that they would come and believe in the God of Israel. You had one job and you didn't do it. In fact, you're making it even harder to do it because it's so corrupt here. The Gentiles are going to look at this and think, you know what, we're better off in our own towns. And it angers Yeshua that this is not happening. But here is the issue. A Gentile cannot enter the temple of Adonai. The moment you put your foot over that threshold, a priest will stone you, because you are in yourself unclean. And there is nothing unclean in the temple of God. Something has to go on here. And there's no point just turning up and just saying, it's okay, God has given me a new heart, I'm a Gentile again. No. I'm sorry, if you're not Jewish, if you're not part of this family, you do not come in. And in fact, this was even crystallized further in the first century, because you then had the call to the women, the call to the Gentile, all that. Now, none of that actually was commanded of God. Interestingly enough, they were all later additions, which the leaders of Israel added on. But it was indicative of the way they were viewing the temple and its different spheres and circles of holiness coming out from the Holy of Holies all the way through. So you have this call to the Gentiles, for those who, as Gentiles, wanted to come and pray. But only up to that point, and that was it. What does the book of Hebrews say then? We enter the Holy of Holies. Right, you know the song? Yeah. We've all sung it a million times. Hebrews is full of it. We now can enter the Holy of Holies. Only the high priest could ever do that. And yet, according to the scriptures, we now have that access. You do not have that access if you are not Jewish. That's for sure. The high priest was utterly Jewish and holy and sanctified and prepared for that one day in the year when he was going into the Holy of Holies. And yet, according to the scriptures here, we now have access to that. The implications of that access are that you've got to be part of the family, because otherwise you're not part of the Kedoshim, the holy ones of God. And Shaul says here, but you are part of the Kedoshim and members of God's household. And that's why the access opens up, that you can now go in. So these Gentiles, he says, that are coming in should be fellow heirs. And we said this yesterday, you can only inherit something if you are part of the family. You've been re-socialized by this point. If you're adopted into a family, you have the right to inherit, even if they're not your DNA parents, because it's a legal thing. You come into Messianic Judaism by faith in Yeshua and his shed blood and everything around that with his salvation. At that point, says Shaul, you become a fellow heir of the same body. And the body he's talking about here, the body politic as it were, the politeia in the Greek sense of that word, is Israel. You become a fellow heir of the same body, which is the body that comes through Abraham and through the ages, and partakers of his promise. What did we say the word? Whenever you read the word promise in the Messianic writing, it is talking about the Abrahamic covenant. That was the promise of God. Your descendants will be like the sand and the stars in the sky, which you will not be able to count. And that's not just those who are born Jewish, it's all those of the nations who will come in too. And that prophecy and promise has been absolutely fulfilled now, and has been for the last 2,000 years, in Messiah through the good news. So what Ephesians 2 is really saying to us, we're coming to an end, don't worry, I know we're good, but we're coming to an end here. Because this really puts the icing on the cake for us, that this shows us in Ephesians 2, if you've got eyes to see it, that the re-socialization that goes on here takes one who is a Gentile, lifts them up and moves them and transitions them into the camp of Israel to become part of the Jewish family. And everything else that makes sense in that process too. It's one of the reasons why, interestingly enough, Timothy was circumcised. Remember, Shaul had Timothy circumcised, right? And I've heard all kinds of Christian arguments about this. And they said, well, no, it's because of his mum, and no, and it was because of this, and no, it's because of all the other Jewish people around that Shaul didn't want to look as if, well, I have all of it, and more. And it's really not difficult. Timothy was not born Jewish. I've got this on Google Jay Cohen is a professor of Judaism. He's an Orthodox Jew, and he knows his Judaism and he knows how it works. Why? Because in the first century, it was patrilineal descent that made you a Jew, not matrilineal. The rabbis changed that. It becomes the matrilineal descent that we know today. Reform Judaism, interestingly enough, Reconstruction Judaism today, has gone back to the Torah model of the patrilineal descent. Rabbinic Judaism hasn't, because where you've got a tradition, you can't change it, right? It's there. You can't do anything about it. Timothy, although he had a Jewish mother, was not Jewish himself, according to Halakha of the first century, because his father was a Greek, Gentile. So that's really interesting, because you've got prima facie evidence right here in the Messianic writings that when Timothy believes, Shaul said, right, you're in, you need to get done. Circumcise him. And also you got Titus, which is the other one people always come back with, and they say, yeah, but Titus wasn't circumcised. You're absolutely right. On Acts 15 level, he was not circumcised at that moment. And the reason why was because Shaul was at pains to show people circumcision doesn't save you. Now, you may or may not be circumcised here. On one level, I'm not interested. That's between you and the Lord. The point is this, though. If you have faith, you are saved and born again, whether you are circumcised or not. Because circumcision doesn't save you. On one level, it's not an issue. Read the book of Romans. He goes on about it again and again. Right? It's exactly this point that he's hammering home. And this is what Acts 15 is all about. How do you get saved? So Shaul was saying to Titus, look, if I circumcise you now, right in the middle of all this big debate that we're talking about, everyone is going to think I'm back to my old ways of doing this. I do not want to confuse anyone. We'll wait up and we'll go through this motion that we have to go through. And there are texts, again I've got photocopies of them in the filing cabinet in my office, which actually suggest and give some evidence of the fact that Titus in fact later was circumcised. But he just wasn't done then. Alright, so it's kind of interesting. So you see that for Shaul, when he was bringing in these Gentiles into the movement, he was bringing them in fully as Jews in the way that was expected in the first century. The resocialization is one aspect of it. The next aspect of it also is immersion. Well, guess where the church got that from? Right? Stole it from us. Should give it back. It's ours. We want it back. Immersion, when you're born again, is about washing off your Gentile background. Because you're ritually unclean. It's got to go. You've got to be washed off. And you come out the water, you declare, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Echad. God is one, and you proclaim your Hebrew name for the first time. And you may not have realised this as well. When Shaul says, and all who call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. Do you know what calling upon the name of the Lord was in the first century? Declaring Shema Yisrael. That was it. That's what you did when you came out of the water. All who declare Shema Yisrael, Adonai Echad will be saved when you come out of the water. As a Gentile, you declare then, He is my God. And that's your salvation. Actually, to be fair, Muslims also did a good steel act on this as well. If you convert to become a Muslim, I'm not going to say because you don't take a name of another God on your lips, but what do when you become a Muslim? You have to declare, it's God, you know the Arabic people when they say it. They got that idea from Judaism. Of course they did. They got all their good ideas from Judaism. Just as the church did. There's no big surprise on that. But the idea behind it is you declare the name of the Lord, you call upon His name, and you will be saved. And you come out the water of immersion, you've washed off the Gentile background, and you then enter the Jewish community as a full covenant member. That has always been the way that it was. The problem is that the churches, having ditched that through Constantinian processes, having removed themselves from this Jewish understanding and background, then approach the texts context-free, and they end up in a car crash. The bits that just don't even make sense. Because if Shaul was not preaching circumcision, he was a heretic, as we've already said. Because what does the Torah say? And you will circumcise for all eternity, in perpetuity, because it is an eternal sign, says God. Nowhere in the Torah do we read that God says you should stop circumcising. Ever. ever does it say that. And if Shaul was teaching the abandonment of circumcision, then he was a Jewish heretic. Because no one else was teaching it. Sorry, it just wasn't the way it is. And this is the joining in of the Gentile. Yes, into the tree, the Nard's trunk and everything else, of course. But it all brings it together nicely as the family. And more than anything else, it really shows us, as we were saying last night, Israel is the head, not the tail. Right? It shows us that this is Judaism. It is Jewish and not Christian. This is the gospel and the understanding of the gospel and the impact of the gospel and the ripples out of the gospel into real time into people's lives right from the get-go is Judaism. And this is what my book is about. I put in the introduction of the book, I said, I wanted to write a Jewish book about salvation and conversion from a Jewish angle, not from a Hebrew Christian angle or anything else. I wanted it to be written as a Jewish book that actually anyone within the Jewish community can pick it up and say, oh, this is a Jewish book, I recognise this. And what they'll read is exactly the process we've talked about today and think, so that's what Messianic Judaism is all about. But they'll get it because it's in Jewish terms. And when you put it back to the gospel in this way, these are the Jewish terms that Shaul uses, and it's the ingathering of the nations unto the one true God. Because God is one. If there's only one God, then who have you got to worship? There's not two gods. There's not a Gentile God and a Jewish God. There's one God, that's the God of Israel. So where have you got to get to if you're going to worship the one true God? You've got to get to Israel, as it were, to the people. Just like in Egypt. If you want your son to live, get into a Jewish house. The model's never changed. God has never changed the pattern that he's established all the way through history. It's just that man's theologies come along and tweaked here and tweaked there. We don't want that, it's too Jewish. We don't know Israel, we don't want that. And so you end up with this Gentile chaos that we've got. And it doesn't make sense, most of it. On a logical level, it doesn't make sense. You put this up as a system, as it were, as a model of salvation within the Jewish context, it all makes sense. It works in a real way. We had, my final thought on this, because then we'll go in, we had a chap called Ted Pierce, who you all know, Messianic Jewish worship leader in the States. He came over and did a concert for us at a conference about 6 years ago now. And it blew him away. And he said to me at the end of the conference, he said, you know what? He said, I really thought this was just going to be another Messianic conference. And he said, it's not. I said, what do you mean? He said, every other conference that I've been to, they're talking about Messianic Judaism. He says, this is the first conference I've been to where you're actually doing it. And he said, it's obvious that this is different. You're doing Judaism, you're not talking about it. You're not talking about the Jewish background to X or the Jewish background to Y or why Yeshua used that term for this Christian thing. He says, you're not talking about it. Every other conference that I've been to and sung at, that's what they have done. He said, you're doing it. You're actually doing it. And it blew his mind up. And he said, conceptually, he said, I can see this is different. And he loved it. Good man. Texas man. Typically Texan as well. He stayed in my house for a week, which was interesting. Lovely man. In case he's watching this later. He's a lovely guy. But he saw that difference. And I think this is the key. Jewish people will see whether we are Jewish or not. They'll see the authenticity, and this is about identity again, wearing the talit and the zot on the doorposts and the kosher and all of these things, the kippot. They will see the authenticity of the Jewish lifestyle mixed with faith. Because it's got to be that. Anyone can put a kippah on their head. It means nothing at the end of the day, right? It's just a piece of cloth. But you mix it with faith and identity in Messiah, and it becomes a powerful testimony. A witness of who you are. And that is the difference that it really makes. Amen. Should we close in prayer?